So, good evening, everybody, and welcome to another of Natecla Scotland's monthly online forums. We're delighted to be joined by Steve Brown this evening, a long-time friend and colleague of Natecla Scotland. Before I introduce Steve and get this forum started, please can we request that you keep your microphones muted, as it helps with everybody's sound quality. Please also feel free to choose whether you keep your video on or off. Steve has left time at the end of the session for questions, thoughts and ideas, but we will be monitoring the chat throughout the session as well. So please feel free to pop anything in there too. You're very welcome to use the chat box now to say hello and tell us where you're from as well. So it gives me great pleasure to introduce Dr. Steve Brown from the University of the West of Scotland. Steve has a long and varied ESOL and ELT career, which has seen him work all over the globe in a variety of settings, right from being a volunteer through to being an FE lecturer and now a Director of Studies and Programme Manager of an MEd TESOL at a university. Steve is going to talk to you tonight about a fascinating subject, that being the place of global course books in ESOL teaching and their connection, or perhaps that should be their lack of connection thereof, to equalities legislation. Without further ado, and with my thanks, I'll pass you over to Steve.
Thank you very much. Bear with me for a second while I sort out my PowerPoint and share it with you all. Thank you, Pauline. Can everybody see that okay? Yeah, great, thank you. Right, I'll just get started then. So thanks very much for that very nice welcome, Pauline. It's always a pleasure to be doing work for Natecla Scotland. This is the title. I'm not quite sure if fatal mismatch is quite the right expression, but I think there's probably enough in the title for you to get the idea of what I'm planning to talk about today. There have been plenty of studies and there's plenty of literature out there about global course books, and there are plenty of other people have critiqued global course books before me. This particular webinar, or this particular, what do we call it again? Session, is presenting findings from a new study, which is exploring global coursebook content from an equalities perspective. So I think there's a bit of originality there. And let me just show you what I'm planning to cover. As Pauline said, I'm going to just kind of talk for hopefully, well, about 45 minutes. I'll try not to talk for any longer than that. And then there'll be about 15 minutes at the end for you to ask some questions or join in on a discussion. So basically, I'm going to be looking at global course books and the role that they currently play in the Scottish ESOL context. Then I want to look a little bit at some of the equalities legislation that we as ESOL practitioners in Scotland are kind of expected to comply with. Then I'm going to describe the study and present the findings from it and talk a little bit about the implications of those findings with regard to ESOL in Scotland and the equalities agenda and the way that global coursebooks contribute to that or not. And then we'll look at some alternatives to using global coursebooks, and then there's a bit of open discussion at the end. Okay, so to start with, you know, we need to kind of define what global coursebooks are. I think you probably know what I'm talking about. If you're an English language teacher, if you've got any kind of experience working in English language teaching, you've probably encountered global coursebooks at some point or another. There's a picture of them there from Hannah Tisha's blog. And John Gray defines global coursebooks in this way, that genre of English language textbook which is produced in English-speaking countries and then is designed for use as the core text in language classrooms all around the world. So that's the kind of definition that I'm kind of going for. Although that's from 2002, I think probably it's the case, it's not always the case now that these books are produced in English-speaking countries. They might be written by people who are based in the UK, but they're probably printed in Indonesia or somewhere. Anyway, that's the books, the types of books that I'm talking about here when I use the term global course books. So what role do they play in the ESOL context in Scotland? Well, they're very commonly used as the sort of syllabus structure. I've certainly worked in ESOL context in Scotland where you're given a book and basically the course is the book, which you're expected to kind of follow sequentially. And yes, of course, you're going to adapt it. You might not use everything. You'll probably supplement with other things, but it remains the kind of principal source of content. And then the other way in which global course books get used, and again, I've used them in this way, working in colleges in Scotland, as kind of sources of materials. So there might be an existing syllabus, and then in the teacher's room, there's a big load of different course books, which teachers can then draw on and sort of copy from and select from as appropriate to fit with the syllabus that they've got. And just in terms of how widely used they are, I don't really have any very, very hard evidence to show just how prevalent they are. But I did do a study a few years ago. I did a little survey of further education college lecturers, ESOL lecturers, and asked them, you know, where their materials come from. 57% of the respondents, there were about 55 people responded to my survey, and 57% of them said that global course books are their primary source of content, and 18% said that they're the secondary source. So that kind of suggests that they do play a very, very big role. That's 75% of the respondents to my survey. So that suggests that they do play a pretty big role in the college sector, and they're also pretty widely used in community learning and development as well. Those are the two different locations, two different contexts where most ESOL takes place in Scotland. So next question then, why are global course books so widely used and why are they so popular? Well, here are some reasons. You know, they look nice. They're usually very kind of glossy, nice pictures, lots of color. Another reason, of course, you know, it saves you a lot of time on planning. If you've got a book there, the lessons are already there. And if you want to, you could basically just start at page 1 and follow the whole thing, and you wouldn't really need to plan anything much at all. It's not just that every lesson's already there for you, but the actual syllabus is there too, so you don't even need to design a course. The fact that they're so popular, they're sold all around the world, millions of copies get sold, maybe gives us the impression that, well, you know, safety in numbers, loads of other people are using them, so they must be all right. And then another thing that kind of feeds into that is the fact that, you know, the publishing companies are these big organizations, they're very reputable. Most coursebook writers are also kind of well-known, respected people in the field. So, you know, that's another reason why people might have confidence in using global coursebooks. And then the other reason, of course, that students often expect to have a book. So, you know, I think those are maybe the main reasons. There may well be others why global coursebooks are so popular. But we also shouldn't forget that they have received quite a lot of criticism over the years. That I'm not even going to bother talking about. I've just got a little picture of Scott Thornbury looking at me. I'm not even going to bother talking about the lack of congruity between global coursebooks and principles and theories of second language acquisition. I'm not even going to touch on that today. Scott Thornbury's already written about that loads, and so have many other people. But there's plenty of other reasons why they've been criticised. John Gray has been quite critical of this sort of what he calls the one-size-fits-all approach. If you're trying to appeal to everybody, you end up not really appealing to anybody directly. One-size-fits-all is another way of saying this size doesn't fit anybody really. So that's a possible criticism. And one of the kind of consequences of taking this one-size-fits-all approach is an avoidance of any topics that might be seen as controversial or, you know, that might not go down well in certain contexts in certain places around the world. So there's a list of sort of topics that coursebook publishers deliberately avoid so that there's no conflict, so there's no controversy. And they're normally referred to as parsnips, because that's an acronym of the topics that they tend to leave out. I don't know whether you've heard of this before, but parsnips stand for politics, alcohol, religion, sex, narcotics, isms, and pork. So, and publishers will quite openly talk about this and say, yes, that's right, we do try to avoid those things. So it might seem ridiculous, but it actually is, it's true. And another criticism, David Block in particular, and also John Gray have written about the lack of focus on issues that are related to kind of working class life. And of course, if you consider the positions that a lot of ESOL learners in Scotland find themselves in, they very often occupy low paid, low status positions in society. If there is a lack of focus on working class life, that kind of suggests that there might, you know, a lot of the materials aren't necessarily going to resonate with ESOL learners in Scotland. And instead of issues relating to working class life, what they often promote instead are sort of what might be regarded as, or what might be described as neoliberal values. There was a study by Keith Copley, and his kind of study revealed that a lot of global coursebook content seems to be promoting kind of a neoliberal ideology, that sort of very right-wing, ultra-capitalist worldview where the market controls everything and everyone is a kind of a commodity. Success is all about individualism and competition and competitiveness, as opposed to more sort of community-oriented ideals. So that's also been a criticism of global coursebooks recently. So all of that kind of calls into question the relevance of global coursebooks. Before I even start telling you about the study that I'm going to tell you about, already I think we should be calling into question the relevance of global coursebooks for ESOL learners in Scotland. Try integrating into Scotland without learning anything about alcohol. I mean, so before we even look at anything else, we can already be a little bit critical of global coursebooks. But now let's start looking at some equalities legislation that exists in the UK. If we start with the Equality Act, this is an act that was passed in 2010. It aims to protect members of society who are potentially vulnerable to discrimination, and it identified these 9 protected characteristics, which are characteristics that people may have and because of which they may be vulnerable to discrimination. Okay, so that's the Equality Act, which aims to protect members of society who fit within these 9 protected characteristics. Then there's the Equality Duty, which is basically well, it's a duty, it's not an act, it's a requirement for action to be taken to ensure that those characteristics are protected. So this is about eliminating unlawful discrimination and harassment, advancing equality of opportunity, and fostering good relations. Now, this is basically a requirement for any kind of government institution or any educational institution, particularly an educational institution that benefits from government funding. All educational institutions are kind of required to promote the equalities agenda across everything they do. So that includes obviously protecting any vulnerable groups or potentially people who are potentially vulnerable to discrimination within the organisation, but it also relates to curriculum design and curriculum content. Now, there's other legislation out there which is even more kind of focused towards the needs of ESOL learners in Scotland. In particular, we've got the New Scots Strategy, which is the sort of refugee integration strategy, and its vision is that people are able to live free from persecution as valued members of communities. There's a Scottish Government white paper on, well, I can't remember what it was called now, but it's a white paper on the equalities agenda in the college sector, and it says equality sits at the heart of the college sector. And as I've said, a lot of ESOL in Scotland is delivered in colleges. And then for the community learning and development sector, their Standards Council website page says that they should always be valuing equality of both opportunity and outcome, and actively challenging discriminatory practices. As you can see, all this sort of equalities legislation is really quite firmly embedded in most Scottish ESOL teaching contexts. And then, of course, the ESOL learners themselves, it's really important. Equalities legislation is really important for ESOL learners in Scotland. So many of them fall within the 9 protected groups. Well, probably all of them, and many of them fall within several of those protected groups. Obviously, being migrants living in Scotland, not having been born here, they do potentially face a lot of discrimination from the wider population. But the other things to think about are that they often come from countries that don't have equalities legislation enshrined, that don't protect people because of aspects of their identities. And therefore, they need to know what their rights are, but they also need to know what the rights of other protected groups are, so that they know what their responsibilities are towards them. And all of this stuff is really, really important for successful integration into Scottish life, which is effectively what we're doing as ESOL practitioners. I'll talk now about the study itself. And this is a study that I did with Christine Nangi. I don't know if any of you know Christine, but she has been working for many, many years first in the college sector and then in community learning and development in Glasgow. And we wrote an article, and well, we're hoping that it's going to get published soon. It's currently under review. So hopefully that's going to be out later this year. And yeah, the title is Global Coursebooks and Equalities Legislation, a Critical Study. Basically, what we wanted to do is to just explore global coursebooks from an equalities perspective, and using the 9 protected characteristics as a kind of an analytical framework. So it was a sort of critical discourse analysis, multimodal. So we weren't just looking at the text, we weren't just looking at the language that's in there, we were also looking at some of the images and various other aspects of the kind of semiotics, the layout, the size of the pictures, the makeup of the characters that are in the visuals, who has a big story told about them, who doesn't, all of that kind of stuff as well. And we basically just took each characteristic and went sort of through each of them, and we analysed 2 course books. So these were the books that we chose to include in the study. Now, we chose these, obviously this is a very small study, I should say that first. We only chose 2 books, and we only chose the intermediate levels of each book. We chose intermediate level because we felt that's maybe a level that's perhaps quite common in the Scottish ESOL context. And we chose these 2 books because they're slightly different in the way that they are branded and presented. Headway, as you probably know, it's been around for ages, since the 80s. It's a very long established global course, but probably the first of the format that kind of paved the way for everybody else to follow. Outcomes is a more recent publication, and it seems to be sort of positioning itself as a kind of slightly different and alternative to other global course books. So we wanted to kind of look at the 2 different ones to see if there was any difference between them. So basically what I'm going to do now is present some of the findings, just taking each protected characteristic one at a time, briefly summarising what our findings were. There's not time to go into all of the data, obviously, so it's basically just going to be a very quick summary of each characteristic and what we saw in terms of how it's represented in each of the books, and a couple of examples, and that's basically all I've got time to talk about today. So if we start with age, I think maybe the first thing to say in both of the books is that the characters are kind of overwhelmingly young. There are not as many older people as there are younger people. And then when older people are represented, there's often stuff in the language and in the semiotics that kind of combine to evoke sort of associations between old age and loneliness, infirmity, dependency, having nothing to look forward to. There's a few kind of ideas that like that seem to come out from any mention of older people. There's also an interesting strategy, I don't know what else to call it, of making older characters seem younger than they actually are in order to suit a specific narrative. So Headway, for example, has got a biography of Calvin Klein, the fashion designer, and it's got a photo of Calvin Klein looking very kind of powerful and next to his brand logo, and he's aged about 50 in the photo. But actually, at the time when the book was published, Calvin Klein would have been 70 years old. So, why did they do that? Why did they show a photo of him 50 and not 70? And there are also some attempts to represent age a little bit more positively. Outcomes does quite a lot of that, but I don't know, they just seem a little bit clumsy. Here's a story that appears amongst a series of texts about how to become famous. That's the title, and there's a series of little texts about that. So as you can see, it's about this group. I'll give you a minute to read it, actually. Why don't you just have a minute to read that? Okay, so it's about the Zimmers, the group of elderly people. They formed a band, they had a hit single. But the thing that sticks out for me with this is it starts with the line, "Age is no barrier to becoming famous." Well, that's not actually the case, age can be a barrier well, it may be a barrier to becoming famous, but it can be a barrier to lots of other things. And that's why it's one of the protected characteristics. So to suggest that age isn't a barrier is kind of implying some sort of dismissal or lack of sympathy for any sort of suggestions that the elderly people actually need to have their rights protected. So I think it's supposed to be a positive representation, but it's slightly clumsy. Plus the fact that this was all done it was a TV program. So it was they were effectively a manufactured pop band. They were manufactured by a documentary maker. There's no real agency on the part of the older people themselves. So I feel it's not a particularly positive representation at all, actually. They're a manufactured pop band, and probably somebody else made more out of this than they did. Okay, let's move on to disability. So I think maybe the most obvious thing to say about disability is that there's a real absence of disabled people in both of the books. There's not a single image of anybody with a visible disability in either of the books. And when disability is mentioned, it's not always done in a very helpful way. Those texts about how to become famous and outcomes, there's some discussion prompts in there. And one of the discussion prompts is physical disability is no barrier to a successful career. And I think students are expected to kind of discuss that, say whether they agree with it or whatever. But the Equality Act's definition of a disability is a physical or mental impairment that has a substantial and long-term negative impact on your ability to do normal daily activities. So physical disability entails a barrier to some kind of career. It entails being a barrier. So suggesting that it isn't a barrier seems to be kind of almost going against what's in the Equality Act rather than supporting it. I mean, it could be that the statement's there to sort of provoke and the students are expected to disagree, but there's no mention that it's the wrong answer or anything like that, so it could quite easily just be agreed with and passed on and just go unchecked. And then another point about disabilities, although it's massively underrepresented, there are opportunities for it to be a lot more represented. It could be brought into the content a lot more, and these opportunities tend to be missed. So, for example, there's a section in Headway where there's a listening with an Ian Dury song. There's even a photo of him, but it's from the waist up. And you know, Ian Dury was quite well known for having a disability himself and for campaigning for disability rights. He did that throughout his career, but of course none of that is mentioned. So there's a real opportunity to properly bring disability and disability rights and the barriers that disabled people can face. There's a real opportunity to bring that into the discussion, and it's certainly not addressed directly. It's not addressed directly. Okay, if we go on to gender reassignment, well, there's nothing really to say about gender reassignment except that, you know, if you thought disability was poorly represented, gender reassignment's got nothing. There's no photos, there's no text, there's no mention of trans people or trans rights or anything in either of the books. So I guess we just move on. If we talk about marriage and civil partnership, there's quite a lot of mention of marriage in both of the books, but it does tend to be presented as a sort of heteronormative institution. It's something that happens between men and women, and it leads to having children. It doesn't happen after the children. It happens first, and then the children are born. Any overt descriptions of non-heterosexual marriage or civil partnership are completely absent. There aren't any mentions of that. And Headway has a text about a man in his late 20s who's happy. He's in his late 20s and he's happy doing part-time jobs and he's happy being single and doesn't want to get married. And the title of the text is My Crazy Uncle Joe. So, I mean, that's kind of problematic because it seems to be othering him for his alternative lifestyle. He's still single in his late 20s and he's got a part-time job. It's not exactly an old, you know. But anyway, it seems to be othering him for that. But of course, the use of the word crazy, that word itself has been identified by quite a lot of mental health charities and organizations as a stigmatizing word. So yeah, it's actually quite damaging from a mental health perspective, I would have thought, to be using words like that. So yeah, anyway, back to marriage. Single parent families are massively unrepresented. It's very much heteronormative, you know, husband, wife, children. And a lot of the representation is a sort of fairy tale narrative. There's, the other thing I didn't mention, no single parents or kind of alternative family models. It's always, yeah, two parents and children. And a lot of the mention of marriage is this kind of fairy tale narrative. I'm going to just give you a second to read this little story from Outcomes. Never mind the incorrect verbs. You don't have to correct them or anything. So, sorry if that's not quite enough time to read it, but I'm conscious of time. So I find this one particularly interesting because it looks like it might be describing a gay relationship right up until the second last sentence. You know, he met this guy and the guy took him, the guy helped him and took him back to his house. And maybe that's kind of the intention. Maybe it's supposed to create some sort of ambiguity for the students so that they're supposed to be reading going, oh, hang on. Ooh. But then, of course, at the end, the fact that it was actually the sister that he fell in love with means that it does just conform to the usual kind of stereotype at the end anyway. But the fact that the whole story is about the men and the woman only appears, you know, he's talking about his own mother. He's talking about how his parents met, but his mum doesn't appear until the second last sentence. It's all entirely from a male perspective. And the female partner is almost irrelevant. There's hardly any description of the female in this. So that's I'm not quite sure what the intention is, but I don't think I don't think the outcome is particularly positive there in terms of representation. So if we go on to pregnancy and maternity, this kind of heteronormative patriarchal sort of undertone carries into this theme as well. Outcomes doesn't have any pictures of pregnant women at all, and Headway has got one, which I'm going to show you in a minute. Pregnancy does seem to be, whenever it's mentioned as something that happens to women after they've married a man. You know, there's no kind of mention of people becoming pregnant as a result of anything else, like before they married a man, or while they're in a relationship with a woman, or anything like that. There's no mention of any related rights, which I find, particularly when it comes to the Scottish context, quite a big omission. If you think about the demographic of ESOL learners in Scotland, the last college that I worked in, the students were 70% female, and the average age was kind of early 30s. So pregnancy, maternity rights, in the workplace, public places, breastfeeding, all of that kind of stuff is really relevant to so many ESOL learners in Scotland, and it's just not mentioned. And then when it is mentioned, it's done within this very sort of heteronormative context. No same-sex parenting, no single parents. And then, yeah, I'd like to just share, sorry. There we go. Share that image with you, which is from Headway. That's the one picture of a pregnant woman in both, out of all the images in both of the books. There is a pregnant woman, but the text is a recording that accompanies it, where basically what the story is, the pregnant woman is worried about the future world that their child is being born into. And then the male partner is offering sort of words of reassurance. It's a first conditional activity, but the messages that are being conveyed here, it seems to be conveying this message that basically pregnant women are emotional and irrational, and they need a man to reassure them and be the sensible one and to support them through it. So that's not a great message in terms of supporting the equalities agenda. Okay, let's talk about race. So first of all, the first thing to say is that there isn't any kind of attempt, no direct attempt to challenge racism as a social issue or a global issue. There's no mention of structural or systemic racism. And some of the representations are quite problematic. In terms of the representations, Headway, for example, 75% of the pictures of the characters in Headway are white, which is a bit odd considering it's a global course book, right? But also a lot of the non-white people in Headway are kind of nameless. They don't actually have a story to accompany them. It's just like a picture of some people, but no sort of supporting commentary. And there's one photo of that kind of follows that example that I find particularly striking. There's a black athlete doing a long jump, but it's problematic for a number of reasons. The first thing is, well, a black athlete doing a long jump, that kind of stereotypical kind of old trope about black people being good at sports. It certainly isn't challenging that. Secondly, the stadium is empty. So again, from a semiotic perspective, it's giving this kind of impression that nobody's actually interested in him, in the athlete, and what he's doing or his achievements or anything like that. And then thirdly, the whole purpose of this photo is to introduce vocabulary for parts of the body. So this athlete is effectively being depersonalized, almost dehumanized. And he's basically being reduced to a physical specimen that the students are supposed to point at. 2021. And if we look at outcomes, there are some more diverse, there's more diverse racial representation in outcomes. There are a lot more diverse kind of pictures and images. But there are clearly some attempts to represent race in more positive ways, but sometimes it's a little bit problematic. So here's an example. There's a text about asylum seekers, and it's about an Afghan man. There's this little story about an Afghan man who has arrived in Australia as an asylum seeker. And I'm just going to give you a minute to read the first part of that text, okay? So you can see, I'm sorry, I'm conscious of time though. The text is sort of talking about the persecution of ethnic minorities, and it's drawing our attention to the fact that, you know, some people have to leave their home country in order to feel safe, and so that's all really quite positive, you know, in terms of the way that it's representing, you know, it's personalizing the story, etc. However, it moves on. So that bit that I just showed you is on the left. You can see the image in the middle. And I'm going to give you a little bit of time again to read the way the text continues on the right. So I don't know whether you've had time to read the whole thing yet, but you could probably see that the narrative sort of shifts and it starts to become about how asylum seekers contribute economically to the countries that they move to. So it stops being a story about racial oppression, and it starts to become, it sort of turns into a kind of celebration of neoliberal entrepreneurialism. You know, we can like this asylum seeker, but that's because he's an entrepreneur and he's started up his own business and he's starting to contribute economically. It's like we're only valuing these asylum seekers for the economic contribution that they can make. The humanitarian aspect of it is kind of dismissed as the text continues. And of course, you know, there have been a lot of confusing narratives in the British press and probably elsewhere too about, you know, economic migrants being kind of not real refugees somehow. Their legitimacy is kind of devalued because they're only coming here for economic reasons. So it kind of adds to the confusion of that whole narrative. And then, of course, the picture, they're almost all young men on a boat. You know, if you've got any kind of anti-immigration sentiments, feelings going on in your head, and then you see that picture, it's not going to disabuse you of those sentiments, I would argue. Okay, so race, a little bit problematic there. Now, religion or belief. The thing about religion, it's another parsnip topic, so obviously we wouldn't expect there to be much mention of it. And certainly the students themselves are not really encouraged to talk about religion or faith. It's not really mentioned explicitly. But the weird thing about it is that both books do have religious figures, religious characters, who they provide profiles of, but they do it without mentioning their religion. And they include lexis that's related to religion, but they don't provide any guidance for how we're supposed to teach it. And you know, there's an example. I'll just show this very briefly. That's from Headway. And the section, the page is about how to write a biography. And then the example is basically they've managed to produce a biography of Mother Teresa without actually mentioning that she was a Roman Catholic, without saying anything about her actual religion. But there's lexis that's related to religion. So there's words like missionary and convent, and there's a phrase, she felt called by God. So the teacher's probably going to have to clarify this language, but there's no guidance on how that's supposed to be done, and certainly no guidance on how it can be done in a positive way, or a way that kind of protects the rights of people who have who follow religions or have quite strong religious beliefs. So, you know, that's not particularly helpful. So moving on to sex, well, both books are you know, representing men and women more or less equally. Obviously, no mention of intersex or non-binary identities, but if it's just men and women, they're represented more or less equally. Outcomes even has some questions about discrimination against women in the workplace. It sort of asks students to consider discrimination in the workplace, and but you know, there's no sort of guidance on what the right or wrong answers should be for that. So it's quite possible that students would just go, no, we don't have discrimination, and the discussion moves on, or it just closes down. Both books have got this sort of tendency to promote narratives of patriarchal normativity. So your usual gender stereotypes tend to be just reinforced. I mean, I've shown you the thing with the pregnant woman already, who seems to be having to defer to her husband all the time to get reassurance. There's this example in Headway as well, also in Headway. 3 women are interviewed about their kitchens. So we've got these 3 women very happy, smiling in their own kitchen. So it's kind of giving the impression that, you know, the kitchen is their domain. That's where they're happy. They're all from different countries. So it gives this sort of impression that the idea that women's places in the kitchen is a universal. The woman as homemaker role is a universal role, cuts across all cultures. So again, pretty unhelpful narrative, I would suggest. And then in terms of sexual orientation, this is the last one, by the way, of the 9 characteristics. Well, this has received quite a lot of attention lately in the world of ELT. John Gray's been doing quite a lot of work on it. Tyson Seburn's written quite a lot and presented a lot of things about the absence of LGBTQIA plus representation in global coursebooks. And there are lots and lots of missed opportunities as well. It's not just that they're avoided, but you know, that sometimes there's an opportunity to focus on something and it just isn't taken. You know, Calvin Klein, for example, has talked openly about his bisexuality, but Headway likes to present him as this far more youthful than he is, kind of alpha male. So yeah, there's quite a lot of examples of kind of ambiguous representations as well with regard to sexuality. Here's another one from Headway, where you've got a woman who's basically writing home to her parents from Chile, where she's having a holiday. I'll give you a second just to read the postcard. So when you read through that, you can see, you know, and look at the pictures as well, you know, so it's quite clear that they're not blood relatives. They seem to have shared the same hotel room last night. They're wrapped together in a blanket in the photo. They're very close. The photo's got a kind of some sort of rainbow scarf. Is that some kind of sort of association with LGBTQIA plus rights? Maybe. So there's a sort of invitation, a kind of tacit invitation to speculate, and it provides scope on the one hand for the teacher to introduce and to raise awareness to LGBTQIA plus lifestyles, but it's equally a kind of a dog whistle for students who might want to make homophobic comments in the classroom. You know, just by creating space like that, it could go either way, depending on how the students respond. And there's no guidance for the teachers on how they're supposed to deal with that if it actually happens. So briefly, I want to just kind of summarize 3 sort of themes. This is us having looked through all of the 9 characteristics. The first sort of, there are 3 kind of themes, I suppose is maybe not the right word, but ideas that seem to come out of it. And the first one is this idea of invisibility. You know, I mean, I've mentioned parsnips before, and coursebook publishers are quite unapologetic about the whole parsnip thing. It just makes good business sense as far as they're concerned. But from an equalities perspective, invisibility is a form of othering, of making people feel like they don't belong, that they don't fit into the worldview that their educational institution recognizes. And remember, most educational institutions that teach ESOL in Scotland are receiving government funding. So by extension, if they're not being recognised by their educational institution, does that mean that they're not being recognised by their government, by the Scottish Government? It may well raise that question. And it also means that if students hold any kind of homophobic or racist or disablest views or whatever kind of views, they're allowed to go unchecked because there's nothing in the materials that's going to challenge them. The second thing is that, when there are representations of some of these groups, they can be quite negative. Not always, but they can be, or they have the potential to be perceived negatively. So obviously, anytime that happens, anytime there's a negative representation, then that's quite damaging to the equalities agenda. And then, of course, the last kind of theme is just the missed opportunities, the fact that there are opportunities in both books to really tackle some of these issues head on, and they're just avoided. And they're avoided almost to the point of looking ridiculous. The fact that, Ian Jury's a very good example, Mother Teresa again as well. There's a lot of exploration and discussion about religion and charity work as a result of your faith and all of that kind of thing. Completely missed. I know the writers of the books and the publishers would probably argue that these ambiguities and omissions are deliberately there to create space for the teachers to bring them up if they think it's relevant. But that's just not enough as far as the equalities legislation goes. Materials are supposed to be actively promoting these 9 characteristics, and they just aren't doing that. Okay, so if we return, I think it's important to just kind of return to just look to get a good handle on this. Let's return to some of the legislation and the legislative obligations that we're all supposed to be meeting as ESOL practitioners in Scotland. The equalities duty is aiming to eliminate unlawful discrimination. Well, it's hard to see how there's anything in either of these books that is attempting in any way to eliminate unlawful discrimination. There's evidence of actually there's evidence that some of these materials could fuel discrimination rather than combat it, rather than eliminate it. And there's content that teachers could be using as starting points for discussions about social justice issues, yes, but there's nothing that guides them on how to do that. So, that's problematic. Advancing the equality of opportunity, again, if we're using global course books, well, it's hard to see how you can be possibly advancing the equality of opportunity between trans and cis people, for example, or disabled and non-disabled people, if there aren't any trans people in the books, or disabled people, or gay people. If these people are not represented, then how can you be advancing equality of opportunity? How can you foster good relations between trans people and cis people if there aren't any trans people being represented? The ESOL strategy, our own ESOL strategy, says ESOL provision. This is just in the vision statement at the beginning. ESOL provision helps to advance equality of opportunity for all individuals. That's just there as a statement. I would suggest that if we're using global course books as our main source of materials, maybe that calls this whole statement into question. And the new Scots strategy declares that Scotland is a place of safety for everyone, where people are able to live free from persecution as valued members of communities. Well, that's a great vision, and that's a great thing for us to be aspiring to. But again, I don't think there's much or anything indeed in the course books that we've studied that tries to make Scotland a place of safety for everyone, that tries to make it safer for people who have those protected characteristics. So if we go back, I'm running out of time here. If we go back to these questions, these statements about why global course books are so popular, and then we consider the equalities issues that I've raised today and the findings from the study that Christine and I did, I just would argue, I think, that these are not good enough reasons. And anyway, without even looking at the equalities agenda, we can argue against these reasons anyway. I mean, they're nicely presented and they're very high quality. Well, yeah, so are other materials. Yeah, okay, great. You know, you might be using a course book that's got things about restaurants and ordering food, and there's a little thing inside the course book that looks exactly like a restaurant menu. Do you know what else looks exactly like restaurant menus? Restaurant menus. You know, what's wrong with authentic materials? And in addition to that, you know, we've all got, I'm sitting right in front of it right now, we've all got incredibly powerful desktop publishing devices that we can use, and we can produce our own materials that are very, very high quality. Tyson Seburn's been doing some really good work in some of his conference presentations in the last couple of years, showing us mock-ups of basically pages that look exactly like a global course book, but they're full of, you know, LGBTQIA plus characters. So that's not a really very good reason as far as I'm concerned. Yeah, it saves time on planning. Now, again, I would argue that that's not a legitimate argument, or certainly that doesn't mean that that's not a good reason for using course books. That's a good reason for giving us more planning time. You know, those of us who work in the college sector, or I don't anymore, but I used to, we went on strike over this. Remember, prep time matters 3 or 4 years ago? We went on strike because we weren't given enough preparation time. And that was part of a whole new agreement that needed to get ratified. So, you know, the problem is not that it takes too long to plan a lesson without a course book. The problem is we're not given enough time. And the fact that global course books exist enables our managers to not give us enough time to plan adequately. Ready-made syllabus entails a prescriptive syllabus. If it's ready-made, if it's prepared in advance, it's prepared without the students being consulted. And therefore, there is no scope for co-creation. Now, as you all know, or should know, if you work in Scotland, one of the objectives of the ESOL strategy is ESOL learners co-create the learning experience. So, moving on, safety in numbers. Well, just because something's popular, that doesn't really necessarily mean it's any good. Lots of things are very popular and they're not particularly good. Romantic comedies are very popular, but they follow a very, very fixed and predictable format. There's a formula to them. You know exactly what's going to happen in the end. You don't really learn anything from watching them, apart from being moderately entertained for about 95 minutes. You see what I'm saying? You know, there's a bit of similarity there. Yes, publishers are very successful, and yes, the writers are no doubt incredibly good and well respected, but they're also totally ignorant of the context that you're working in. Nobody knows your learning context, your teaching context better than you do, and nobody knows the students better than you do. Well, certainly the coursebook writers don't. So I always find that argument slightly insulting to teachers. And of course, students often expect a coursebook. Yeah, okay, students expect all kinds of things. And a lot of what we have to do is disabuse them of that. You know, students want to have every single error corrected all the time. Students want to be taught more grammar, even when that's probably the last thing they need. You know, students want all kinds of things, and we've got no problem disabusing them of these other things that they want if we think that it's not good for their learning. So why do we feel like we have to pander to this expectation to have a course book? Okay, I'm really short of time, so I'm going to just have to rush through this. Sorry, Pauline. Alternatives to global course books that are a little bit more inclusive. I've split this into two sides. So if you're using a global course book, if you've already got a syllabus that you're following and you're just kind of looking for materials to use in order to enact that syllabus, there's lots of other places where you could be looking. Obviously, I've mentioned authentic materials too. ESOL learners in Scotland are, you know, their needs are immediate and relevant and out there, and you know they could be bringing in their own stuff and saying, "Can you help me with this?" Or I saw this, or took a photo of this sign, I couldn't understand what it was. You know, there's all kinds of opportunities for using authentic materials. The SQA ESOL materials, you know, you might not like them, or maybe you do like them. They exist and they're free, but not only are they free and readily available? You can download them in Word document, and as far as I'm aware, there's no copyright issues. You can adapt them and change them as much as you like. So there's opportunities for you to take something as a starting point, a cohesive set of materials, and then adapt it and make it even more inclusive. Francesca Stella and some colleagues did a very interesting, the link is in the references section at the end. They did a very interesting study into the identities of LGBTQIA plus migrants who had moved to Scotland. And then out of that, some additional funding was used to develop some new materials, which are really, really nice, telling the stories of gay and trans and various other migrants who have come to Scotland and telling their stories. Really, really nice. There are other global course books out there that are perhaps not quite so parsnippy. Raise Up, sorry, that needs an exclamation mark. Raise Up is published in Brazil, actually. It's a kind of an alternative global course book that deliberately includes a lot more equalities type issues. And then, of course, you can be developing your own materials banks in your institution. There used to be, the ESOL Scotland website used to have a kind of bank, but nobody put anything in it. But we should be really developing our own banks in our own institutions, but also perhaps creating a more nationally shareable bank of materials. I think that could be a really good thing to do. And then in terms of program design, following again, I've got a little eye on Scott Thornbury, following the sequential structure of a global course book, for many, never mind the equalities agenda, it's wrong for all kinds of other reasons. The whole structural syllabus and, using grammar to drive, to sequence the language input and all of that. It would be far more congruent with second language acquisition principles and theories if we were doing more project-based and task-based language teaching anyway. And bringing in materials that are more relevant to the students' real needs also allows us to follow the social practice model, which is supposed to be driving certainly most adult learning in community learning and development, but it also is supposed to be informing the FE sector too. We can be encouraging our students to have a lot more input and negotiate the syllabus, and basically prioritizing our students' needs over any other thing. Okay, that's me done. It took me a little bit longer than I had planned. I'm very, very sorry. Those are my references. There is a little bit of time, I hope, for questions. Pauline, I'm sorry I've gone on too long.
No, it's so fascinating, Steve. I can absolutely forgive you, don't worry. But I would like to open the floor to anybody, any of our delegates who would like to make comments, ask questions of Steve. I am happy to run over for a bit because I think it's absolutely worthwhile. So please feel free to pop your hand up, unmute yourself, shout out. Anything you want to say would be most welcome. Don't all rush at once. No, oh, well, there we go. Steve, you don't need to worry about running over if no one has any questions there. I'm going to save the chat, obviously, because it's a Zoom call, and I think I'll send it on to you and let you read it. Oh, we do have hello. Tyson and Tim are both waving at me. I like it. Who would like to go first, gentlemen?
I just really wanted...
First. Your question's going to be much smarter than mine, I'm sure.
I don't know. It's not a question. That's the problem. I'm one of those people.
It's always nice to hear your voice anyway.
Oh, thanks. Yeah, you too. I just wanted to say thanks for the way you framed this, really, with comparing or using Equality Acts or legislation specifically to determine what is or is not being done by Coursebook, because that's another, it's a way to speak to teachers or decision makers or publishers or what have you. So thanks.
Yeah, well, thank you, Tyson. I mean, I know that this is close to your heart as well in terms of, as far as representation goes in materials. But I don't want to take credit for that, because the whole idea of using the 9 protected characteristics as an analytical framework was Christine's idea. It wasn't mine. So she should be taking the credit. We need to give Christine the credit for having that idea in the first place.
Okay, well, I take it back then. So,
yeah.
So all credit goes to her then.
Yeah, thank you to Christine. Absolutely.
Thanks, Tyson. And Tim, did you have something you wanted to say?
Yeah, I mean, I just kind of wanted to ask at the start, you were talking about like the legal things that that people need to do. And I just kind of wondered if you had any ideas about if it would be possible to, you know, like make some kind of legal challenge to it if universities kind of have these duties and things like that. I might be one of those where it's like, well, it's kind of technically the law, but there's no one you can really actually sue about it or no one to sue people about it. I just wondered if you'd had any insights about that
Yeah,
in the process.
I'm not quite sure, Tim, to be honest, about what the actual legal ramifications would be. What I do know is that, you know, most educational institutions in Scotland that deliver ESOL are sort of regularly visited by Education Scotland, which is, well, what do you call it in England again? Ofsted? So Education Scotland is kind of like our equivalent of Ofsted. It's an overseeing body that's kind of sort of a quango. It's kind of representing the government, and they come in and they check that we're doing everything to you know, to standard, or we're following the appropriate agendas. So I mean, it's their job really to be coming in and saying to us, what are you doing to promote the equalities agenda? And then up to ESOL providers to be showing what they're doing. And I don't know how keen they are about it or how much they're pushing it. But what I do know, when you read the policies and then you look at what's going on in practice, and you certainly look at the coursebook content, there's a clear mismatch there. And I don't know what the ramifications. I don't know if I don't know if it would ever be the case that an ESOL provider would be closed down because they're using global coursebooks or anything like that. But what I think ESOL providers need to think about, not just in Scotland, but any ESOL provider in the world that is in a country that has equalities legislation sort of enshrined within its educational institutions, I would suggest that it's a good idea to look at that equalities legislation again, and then look at the materials that you're using and just kind of ask yourself, are we actually doing what we're supposed to be doing here? Are we doing what we're paid to do? Because that's effectively the bottom line. I don't know if I've answered your question, because I don't really know the answer, Tim. I just
No, that's fair enough. Yeah, that makes sense.
Thank you, Tim. Has anyone else got any last questions or comments before we close this session for this evening?
Hi, Pauline. This is Abdul from Oxford. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can, Abdul. Go ahead, please. Thanks.
Amazing. So I'm an ESOL specific functional skills tutor at Oxford Health NHS Trust. So I teach functional skills mainly these days. I've worked in community colleges as well. And so I don't know if you saw the conversation going on in the chat, and some of us were discussing whether if we had coursebooks that had more equality and more diverse kind of examples, you know, single parent families, gay couples and that kind of thing, would those books actually be purchased on the world market? Because, you know, as far as I can see, it's very conservative and ultra conservative. So what's your take on that?
Well, I suppose, you know, I mentioned that book Raise Up, which seems to be doing very well, and that's being published for a global market. So I think that the thing about these global publishing companies, they seem to be incredibly risk averse, and they seem to have their model, and they'll stick to it. They don't seem to be keen to diverge from the formula that they've already got that they know works. I mean, that's kind of why I used the romantic comedy as an analogy, because that's basically been around since Shakespeare, and nobody wants to mess with it, because we all know that, you know, that kind of boy meets girl, boy doesn't like girl, something happens and then something good happens at the end and they all get back together again. You know, that kind of storyline is enduring. And I suppose global coursebook publishers, they've hit on this formula. Well, basically, John and Liz Soares hit on this formula in the early 80s. And everybody else has basically just been trying to copy it since then. So I'm not sure what the commercial fallout would be if they did decide to be a lot more inclusive with their materials. It probably means that they wouldn't be able to sell the same book all over the world. But I would argue that they shouldn't be selling the same book all over the world, because you get different learners all over the world with different needs and different contexts and all kinds of, so it's kind of wrong to be doing. I mean, it's McDonaldization is effectively what it is. Scott has talked about grammar nuggets before, and and there's a very interesting article by Andrew Littlejohn about the McDonaldization of English language teaching, and it's basically about following very, very set formulas. I don't know. So clearly they know their business, but the bottom line is it's a business as far as they're concerned, and it's not, education is not the priority. Business is.
Yeah, and just a follow-up question, and sorry to monopolize. Another conversation going on in the chat was that now, how much do we actually use textbooks? When you're teaching an individual or a class, how much of the content comes from online or whatever experiences that are relevant to those students. I personally, when I'm teaching one-to-one, which I do a lot in functional skills for the NHS, I totally tailor it for the student, and picking out from online and book resources. When I've got, say, an elementary class, I really quite religiously stick to textbooks, and I consolidate with other material as and when needed. So what are your thoughts on that? Are we still sticking to textbooks, or are we moving away from that now?
Well, I mean, I don't know what everybody else is doing, really. I'm moving away from them. I think well, I don't know. I suppose my answer is I don't really know what everybody else is doing, and how. But what I do know is that the global course book as an artifact, as John Gray would call it, is very much a feature of the profession. And whether in some contexts they play a big role, in some contexts they don't play such a big role, but they're very much a feature. And I suppose all I'm trying to do today is to just point out the fact that they are such a prominent feature from an equalities perspective is a little bit problematic. And therefore, I think if we are heavily using global course books in our ESOL teaching, I think we should be rethinking that. I suppose that's all I'm trying to say. Abdul.
And I'll just say one last comment, not a question. The head of the BAME network here at Oxford Health, really, really great guy called Mo Patel, he pointed out actually that ESOL provision should be another kind of like protected characteristic. And there's evidence to show that staff at the lower banding within the NHS are made up of BAME backgrounds. So that's a really interesting point that kind of backs up what you were saying earlier.
Yeah, that's a good point. I think that's something that kind of surprised me as well. When you look at the 9 characteristics, language isn't one of them. And there are so many stories around the UK. I mean, Nigel Farage happily fuels this, of people being discriminated against, victims of hate, simply because they're not speaking English. So discrimination against people on grounds of language is a thing. And so, I think, to be suggesting that it perhaps could or should be an additional protected characteristic, and that's probably, there's a strong argument for that, yeah.
Thank you, Steve.
Thank you.
Thank you, Abdul. I know Scott Thornbury had his hand up. Would you still like to comment, Scott? Well,
I was just going to make the point that from a going back a few questions, thanks, Steve, that it's, the publishers have a lot to answer for, but they're not entirely, they also have to answer to ministries, and especially if they're marketing into state school curricula and younger learners, etc. So they have a long list of criteria they have to meet, obviously, and everything goes through the ministry. And if the ministry doesn't like it, then that's it, kind of thing. So they are also part of this kind of whole pyramid of what Abdul said was kind of inherent conservatism in the industry, and it's particularly apparent in the EFL market. I mean, not here in Spain, for example. Spain has a quite relatively liberal attitude to content. In fact, specifies that it has to have what are called these you know, what the equivalent would be civics streams or whatever, then you've got to deal with gender issues, you've got to deal with incapacities, etc., in published course books within the state sector. So I mean, what I'm saying is that I've never thought I'd be defending publishers, but they do have a narrow path to walk globally. I mean, then you could argue, well, they shouldn't be selling books globally. But I mean, it's not going to be it's not going to be improved by the fact that local publishers will take up the vacuum. They still will have to answer to the same prescriptions or proscriptions.
But those prescriptions would be, well, local in that they'd be national rather than global. So
yeah,
it means that if let's say, for example, that a publishing company was producing ESOL course books or an ESOL course book entirely for the Scottish context, then it could then look at Scottish equalities legislation and make sure that it complies with it. And then of course the ministry is going to accept it because it's their policy, it's their language that's being enacted. Obviously, that book is going to look very, very different from a book that would be published in Saudi Arabia, but you know, maybe that's okay. You know, I know what you're saying though, Scott. Obviously, it's a tricky thing, but I feel that if there's a certain, I don't know, I'm maybe going to start sounding a little bit like I don't really know what I'm talking about, but there's a certain greediness and avariciousness about the whole project of trying to create one thing that you can sell all around the world. You know, it just seems a bit greedy.
Well, that's globalization, and that's neoliberalism, and that's big business. I mean, you know, where do you start chipping away?
But you know, the priority becomes profit.
Oh yeah,
it's entirely about profit orientation. That's why they try to. That's why global course books exist, because they're far more commercially viable. There's no educational argument. I don't think.
Now you could also argue that to make a profit, they've got to invest in an enormous amount of, you know, what it costs now to produce a course book, whether it's global or not, all its components, etc., and all the teams and the writers and content is massively expensive. It's not like you're. So I mean, that publishers will argue, you know, we can't afford to take any risks, even if it's for a national curriculum, that we've still got to get it right. I mean, it goes round and round. I just, you know, it's like, it seems to me that the only viable alternative is just to abandon using course books altogether for all the reasons that you said, and don't even support, because we're never going to get the course books that we want, probably, unless we write them ourselves. And I think there are viable alternatives, and I don't see why there are course books in this day and age when there's so much good material that can be created by teachers themselves and so much good material online. It's not like we're back in the 1960s when there were no alternatives, but you know, that's another story.
No, I mean, you know, I remember your article from what you and Luke Meddings did, one in what, 1999, the Roaring in the Chimney, where you were basically saying we should all be chucking these course books on the fire.
I got into a lot of trouble for that.
It was very inspirational. But you know, we're still saying that. We're still saying that now.
Well, yeah, and I mean, actually, Steve, I wrote another article in 1999 about gay invisibility in course books, which disappeared without trace. But that was 1999, and that's over 20 years ago. Nothing has happened really since then, and just makes me despair. I mean, I just don't think. I think we're up against something that is. It's insuperable. So what's the, you know, we just got to work around the back of it and ignore the whole edifice altogether.
Yeah.
Anyway, that's enough of me.
Oh, no, thank you. That's nice to
I cited that essay I cited that article in an essay last year, Scott, so it's not gone completely nowhere.
Oh, okay, thanks.
Thomas Hayward, you've had your hand up for a little while. Would you like to pass something on?
Sorry about that.
That's okay.
Thank you very much, Steve. That was a great talk.
Thanks.
And I've had a lot of qualms about coursebooks for a long time. And what also really strikes me about is how happy and positive and how successful the stories are in coursebooks. And it makes me think about all my students with mental health problems who've experienced trauma. And so I run a mile from them because I think the invisibility of people who've gone through trauma or have mental health issues could be quite damaging. So I just wonder has there been any research into the representation of mental health in global coursebooks?
Not that I'm aware of, but I think that's a really, well, obviously now as well, in a post-COVID world where, mental health is an issue that many of us are, well, increasingly aware of it's becoming an increasingly prevalent problem. And I think, probably all of us, everybody in this virtual room and everybody in the world has in some way or another been affected by the pandemic, and it's been quite tricky for a lot of us. So I don't know whether that means that the whole profile of mental health and mental health issues and the discussions around what that means and how people can live with mental health conditions or be able to overcome them. I don't know whether the discussion is going to kind of increase more anyway, just because of the climate that we're living in now. But I think you're right. It would be very interesting to have a little dig into global course books, or possibly just ELT materials more generally, and see just how mental health is represented. My suspicion is that it's not represented at all.
Yeah,
in the books, in those two books in our study, there was no explicit mention of any kind of disability or mental health issues.
Yeah, in the story you mentioned about the refugee who became a successful businessman, it didn't seem like he was suffering from any trauma at all.
No, and even the first part of the story, it was kind of like, he comes from an ethnic group, and that group suffers persecution. And so his parents decided to pack him off to Australia, and they paid a lot of money. So again, it's like, so they could actually afford to get out, or they could afford to get him out. Yeah, you're right. It doesn't really touch on the trauma and the constant, the impact on your mental health that facing that level of persecution is bound to have. So yeah, you're right. There's a real absence there.
Thanks.
Can I ask Carol to say one last thing for us tonight? I'm aware that we've run over, but Carol, please join in.
Yeah, no, I just wanted to thank Steve. That was really interesting. I think really useful and thought-provoking. I just want to come in, like when Thomas was saying about invisibility, that's what struck me when you were talking about disability, when it first came up about disability. And I think that happens just too often everywhere, this invisibility. So then people don't think of all these different groups, or people don't feel like they belong. So then services don't get provided for different groups as well, because they're seen as rarer than people actually are.
Yes, I think you're right. I think it's not just that we need to be positively representing minority groups, even though it's only a small number of people. It's not like that kind of tokenistic thing. It's actually the absence of it is making people think that it's not as much of an issue as it actually is. Yeah, no, that's absolutely right, Carol. And I think that's just another reason why we need to be making much more of a conscious effort. And I suppose one of the points I was trying to make tonight was that if your starting point is a global course book, it's a lot harder to make a conscious effort to bring that stuff in, because all there in front of you, you've got this ready-made course which looks lovely, and so the temptation is to just, I did page 22 yesterday, I'll do page 23 tomorrow. That's the default. is that you do that. So you actually have to, there's a switch that you have to make to try and make yourself go, oh, hang on a minute, this isn't really very inclusive. I'm going to have to find something else. And then you have to make all the effort to find something else. It's just a really bad starting point at the end of the day. Starting with something that has a really bad attitude towards inclusion and representation, and then trying to make it more inclusive. Why not just start with something that's more inclusive and representative from the outset?
Thank you, everyone. I'm going to jump in and I'm going to pull tonight to a close. I feel that we could probably chat for another 3 hours about this. So, Steve, thank you so much for your time and
Thank
for a
you.
really thought-provoking and insightful presentation. I'm going to share the chat with you afterwards because it's fascinating what some people have to say.
I'm very keen to see you. Yeah.
Steve, if you're happy for people to get in touch with you, would you take a moment and pop your email address into the chat? So if anyone has any other thoughts or questions or wants to touch base with Steve, hopefully he's popping that in right now and you can do that. Otherwise, thank you for joining us for another NATECLA Scotland online forum. It's been super brilliant to have Steve. Thanks everyone for joining us, and I hope to see you at a NATECLA Scotland event soon. Take care, everyone. Good night.
Thanks very much, everybody. Thanks for staying late.